Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive, while also sharing with you our Native culture, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And I hope you'll do me a favor. Feel free to like and share these episodes. I so appreciate it. Yakuki.
I wanted to serve my country, but I joined the National Guard at 17 years old, and I went to basic training in between my junior and senior year. About 3 years in, I volunteered to go to Afghanistan, and I learned a lot about the Mongolian culture. I learned a lot about the Afghan culture. That opened my eyes that there's so much difference in the world, and a lot of people, they've never seen, just the privilege that sometimes we may have.
See and share our stories at togetherwe'remore.com.
You're listening to part 4 of this series.
So there is a cool battle, and I think it's 1848, and it's called the Battle of Caddo Hills, and it's between Choctaws and the Caddo. It's why the town of Caddo, Oklahoma, is named today. Caddo is because the battle that took place there. Again, it's paraphrased, and there's a little bit of embellishment for pleasure for the reader. The Choctaw James Culberson heard this story from an elder that lived there. So there's a little bit of embellishment already there. Sure. But the story's recorded in the Chronicles of Oklahoma. But just south of what is Caddo, Oklahoma today, there was a massive prairie that was there. And then in the middle of the prairie is some kind of elevated terrain, basically some hills that are there. And so in the 1840s, we have Choctaws that are living around the Caddo area. And so there was a war party of, I think, 400 Caddo that came in. And Choctaws were used to the Caddo and other Plains tribes coming in and horse raiding. But we had our herds were so large, Choctaws didn't care if any were stolen. Because it really, in the grand scheme of things, we have 500,000 horses. It's not a big deal, if a few hundred are stolen.
Yeah.
But this time, it was recorded that the Caddo encroached too far in, and they caused property damage and started burning the land and doing other things. So they sent runners over to the district chief, and the district chief raised a militia of the same amount. It's either 400 or 450. It was just the same amount of Caddo warriors. They raised Choctaw warriors. And so all these Choctaw warriors mounted on ponies. They mustered and they went out. So the Caddo had raided, and they had come back, and they had their herd of ponies all in one area. And they were all celebrating on their successful raid. And so the Choctaws on their ponies, they rode in and they broke the herd. That was the first thing they did, is they ran through the herd and they spread them everywhere because they could collect them later. It wasn't a big deal because the horses would come back and they would go out and they would collect them. So that was the first thing they did. But that herd wasn't just the ponies they stolen. It was also the Caddo's horses were in there too. So they split the herd. And then they dismounted and they surrounded the Caddo campsite. And then all at once, they fired into the campsite. And so there were massive casualties, a lot of wounded. And so the Caddo retreated to the hills that were there, which is Caddo Hills. And so the Choctaws finished off the wounded, and then they went down and they followed the Caddo to the hills, and they surrounded the hills. And they basically, the term would be starved them out. But there was a natural spring that was there, and they had it under observation the whole time. So anytime a Caddo would try to get out to get water, they would be shot.
Oh.
And there was nowhere for them to go. And so over a period of a few days, they all ended up either dying from dehydration or from for being killed by trying to break through the Choctaw lines.
They
And
pushed
so,
it too far, and look what happened.
yeah. Um, so the tactic that was really cool is what they did is they surrounded, um, but basically they had shifts. So warriors would be there for 8 hours, and then they'd be off for 8 hours, and a new warrior would come in and take their spot. So they always had someone on shift, and they would, going back and forth through that. Of course, this story is told. It's a non-native person telling James Culberson, who is Choctaw, and so it's already been through a couple set of ears. Um, so take it with a grain of salt, but um, that is the story that I've heard about the Battle of Caddo Hills. I've also heard
That's
that there was a skirmish with the Caddo in 1818, but I haven't found anything on that yet, so I'm still doing some digging.
okay.
So,
Very
but
interesting.
yeah, I mean, and Choctaws, we interacted with the Caddo in Louisiana. There was all these Choctaw people that were leaving Choctaw Nation. They were
Yeah.
leaving the tribe, and then they were coming to Louisiana and setting up villages. But
Huh.
Choctaws were so numerous that the Caddo didn't want to start any issues with these Choctaw villages because we had more warriors than they did. So
That
there was
makes
this kind
sense.
of uneasy kind of truce that we always had with the Caddo early on. But after
Huh.
removal to Indian Territory, I mean, that was, as far as I know, that's the last conflict with the Caddo that we had. So,
Fascinating.
mhm.
All right, let's talk about another one. The Battle of Fort Rosalie, which was in 1729, which was part of the Natchez War, including it included an early conflict between the French and the native tribes. So you have an interesting story about that one as it relates to the Choctaw, right?
I'll do some backstory. So you have the Natchez, or as the Choctaw called them, the Natchez, that are living over in where Natchez, Mississippi is today. And they were allies with the French. Um, but there was a French commander that was in the area for a couple decades, and he was very unreasonable. And so he kept, over time, him and the French government kept pushing the Natchez to the point where they occupied the Natchez Grand Village, which was like one of their most sacred areas. And so the Natchez were just all upset about them occupying the village and, everything else. And then the final straw, something had happened. They had occupied a sacred site. And at that point, the Natchez were like, enough's enough. We've been putting up with you for 20 years. We've asked you not to do these things. And so, looking at it from a unbiased point of view, the Natchez, were in the right, I think, in this regard. So they attacked Fort Rosalie and they took the fort. The French were so scared that these other tribes were going to rise up. There was a group really close to New Orleans, and the French just went out and wiped them out for no reason. They were like, well, I say no reason, but the French went out and just wiped out this tribe because they were so afraid that all these tribes were going to start an uprising against the French.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to do a show of force to show that they were still in control. Choctaws are the largest group in the area, and our chiefs came down and we berated the French and we told them, you don't do this. This is inappropriate. This is wrong. You will not do this again.
Wow.
And then we had to calm the French down. So the next year, the French mobilize and they come to Natchez. They go upon the Natchez sacred mound and they place their cannons on the sacred mound. They loot the mound of the sacred artifacts and stuff that were on there. And they start laying siege to the fort. And Choctaws also come in. And so Choctaws and the French are the ones that attack Fort Rosalie. And so the Natchez end up getting on boats and they go upriver to the Chickasaw. And so some of them settle with the Chickasaw, and then some of those communities move over and they settle with the Cherokee and the Creeks as well. So there's still people with with Natchez ancestry that's still recognized within these communities today.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, and it's always been told from one perspective. But if you look at it from the native perspective,
Yeah.
and so it's also, once that happens, that area is opened up and Choctaws start flooding into that area. But also we start flooding into Louisiana. And so that's when you see all these Choctaw communities starting to pop up in different places in Louisiana because there's a vacuum. And now that the Natchez aren't there anymore, Choctaws come in and swoop up on
Oh,
that.
so that's
But
how that happened.
but a lot of these communities, like I said, these are people that initially go out on these hunting. They're doing seasonal. So during the winter, we had something called the Owachito. And so after all of our warm season duties were completed, the harvest is gathered, the individual families are allowed to do what they want for the winter months. So they all go out in the Owachito, and this is where the family go out on this big hunt, and they would go, build these. They'd either go to these big cities and do trading, like New Orleans or Mobile, places like that, Biloxi, or they would go out to other areas. So Choctaws during the winter would start doing their winter hunts in Louisiana because the area's opened up. But eventually, with settlement pressure and people not always happy with what decisions the Choctaw chiefs are making, you have different Choctaw-speaking people that are leaving Choctaw Nation and they're moving and creating their own communities in Louisiana. And we have all these different Choctaw-speaking people in Louisiana, and that's what eventually forms the Gina Band of Choctaw Indians, the other federally recognized tribe. But there is a cool story, and I don't have the reference for it. And I will preface this with I've been telling this story so long, it is probably severely embellished. So at some point, I will have to make corrections to it.
Well, so many of our stories have been passed down orally, and
Yeah.
who knows what the actual
Mhm.
events actually were, but we just have to do the best we
Yeah.
can. So go for it. I'm excited to hear it.
Yeah. So I will preface this story. So actually, no, I'm going to tell the story first and then we'll preface it afterwards. That's more fun.
Okay.
So there's a group of Choctaw warriors and they come up to this fort, and it's either a French or a Spanish fort. It could be British. Um, but it's in the late 1700s. So it's either British or Spanish. And they trade. And so these warriors, they get a little bit of alcohol from trading with the fort. And so they're having a good time that night and they're drinking and they decide we should take the fort. Sounds like,
Take it.
nothing else to do. So in the middle of the night, they climb up and they sneak over the walls and they go into the fort. And the way that these forts are organized is they have rifles that are set up in like tripods in the center. That's where all the rifles. So if there's an emergency, you run over, you grab your rifle, you're set to go, or muskets at the time. And so all their muskets are setting up. And so the Choctaws go in and they slip in and they start firing all the muskets off. So the garrison, the people that are there, think they're under attack. And so, of course, they're not going to go out to their weapons because someone's already in the fort. So they
Yeah.
all run out the front door and they run out of the fort. And so, Choctaws are shooting, at them in the air, all around, just messing with the fort, getting into the stores, all this stuff. And, the fort commander's there. And so he rallies the garrison back together and they lay siege to the fort. And so throughout the next day, Choctaws are having a good time. They're playing with the cannon, shooting at boats in the river, fun stuff like that, just getting into mischief. And so, I mean, this is a small war party. It's probably like 12 people, it's nothing huge.
Making a big ruckus, though.
Yeah. And the garrison's probably like 15 to 25 people. And so, they know that the fort's going to be assaulted in the morning. So they slip out in the night. When they slip out, they take a bunch of stuff with them. And so they get a good night's sleep. And then that next day, the garrison takes the fort back and, they get everything and they're trying to clean up, all the issues. And so the Choctaws are there and they're sitting there. And so that night again, they got more whiskey when they raided the fort. So they start drinking again and they do it all for a second time.
No.
Yes.
What
And
the heck?
so they slip out of the fort again. And at that point, they realize, well, we've done this twice. We probably won't get away with it for a third time. So let's just go home.
And that was that. That was
And
that.
and that was that. Um, I'm trying to track down the source. It is a story that I read so long ago, but
That is awesome.
yeah,
Just a
it,
wild night out. They got back to the tribe and they're like, y'all won't believe what we just did. It was so awesome.
yeah, that's
And we did
so.
it twice.
We'll be back after this quick break. Are you in the medical field looking for your next opportunity? Listeners, I'm proud to introduce you to Native American veteran-owned staffing company, Worldwide Medical Staffing. Owner and CEO Jackson Weaver is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma and is a service-connected disabled veteran where he and his team staff for commercial healthcare and government entities such as the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and DHS, and specialize in staffing Indian Health and VA hospitals nationwide. Isn't it nice to know that our veterans are being cared for by staff who have been handpicked by a veteran who's been in the staffing business for 17 years? Healthcare job seekers, check out these open jobs on www.medical.com. If you're seeking temporary, long-term, or permanent placement of physicians, advanced practice, registered nurses, and more, check out www.medical.com. And Diakoki to our medical professionals and to those who have served our country.
What's cool about this story is during the late 1700s, there's a transition. So for a boy to become a warrior, to become a man, he has to get that status as a Tvshka, right?
Mhm.
But by the late 1700s, when we start hitting the Spanish and we start hitting the American period, there's less opportunities for warfare
Hmm.
because we're no longer warring with the Muskogee. We're no longer warring with the Chickasaw. A lot of the smaller tribes have already been absorbed in or they've moved off. And so Choctaws as a whole have been weakened because the colonial powers have grown. We're more dependent on the fur trade. So what's happening during this time is as Choctaw people, we're taught to have a balance. With there's a stewardship kind of balance that we have with our environment. And because of things that are going on, usually the chiefs control the trade and the items that come into the community, that come into the village. And that's because we had a close relationship with French traders who respected the Choctaw economy system. The Spanish traders kind of respected it, kind of not, but the British and the Americans did not care. So what ends up happening is now individual men can get things. They don't have to go through their chief. They don't have to go through their village. They can get things on a personal level
Oh,
through the fur
wow.
trade that they couldn't do before.
So it's like a
So
breakdown.
it causes a destabilization and a massive change. So we
Mhm.
start overhunting our homelands. So this one trader talks about how he traveled the length of the entire Choctaw Nation, never saw one deer.
Wow.
And that's because of all the overhunting. And that's why Choctaws are going to Arkansas and Louisiana and Oklahoma to hunt, because we've overhunted the deer population and caused a crash, in our, in the environment there. So there's changes and there's hardships. You have settlement pressures, you have more alcoholism issues. The French and the Spanish kept control of how much alcohol was coming in. The British were supposed to regulate it, but didn't. And the Americans were just throwing alcohol into Choctaw Nation, even though they weren't supposed to be, because they're trying to destabilize the tribe. And so families are suffering. Our individual communities, as I said, the elder women are the ones that are, controlling, law and order within the community. But as people move away from the communities and they start having their own basically ranches and they adopting cattle and horses, they're no longer under the jurisdiction of the village anymore. So who's over them? And that's why we end up adopting in the Choctaw Light Horse in 1820 to help get rid of alcohol and to help manage this new type of policing that needs to be done.
Yeah.
So men are caught in this kind of period of how do they transition as a man with all this pressure, all these changes, all these things that are going on. You have traditional men's roles which are now threatened. And so how do you transition as a man? And so what happens is a lot of the feats that we see, and this is where Greg O'Brien and James Carson talk quite a bit about this, and in in their books, you start seeing these warrior names like Wakabi, which means cow killer, and like horse thief and that sort of thing. And that's because Choctaws are now proving themselves to their peers by raiding communities, or by drinking and having these kind of exemplary feats that they survive through. So this could have been one of those things where when they attacked the fort, this was an opportunity for the young men in that hunting party to gain recognition because they don't have that normal form of transition. So they're trying to create a mode for that transition. It's difficult because even after the Trail of Tears, our men struggle with this. And I think our men still struggle with this today. How do they transition from a boy to a man? We don't have set rules in our culture anymore for that, where we used to.
For sure. And when you were talking earlier about how there's this path. You're As a male, you are born, and the goal is to become a warrior. And then, if you're lucky and work your way into some kind of a chief or something like that, great too. That path is no longer there. So struggling to find their way, they eventually become farmers and they become very good at it. But at the same time, I feel like inside of every man is a warrior, and all of that can be used for good. But where do we put that today? If a man is constantly seated behind a desk, maybe he feels like a warrior, maybe he doesn't. What kind of outlet is there out there for the modern man to still have that warrior status? And maybe it comes in different outlets. Maybe sometimes people play golf, maybe some people hunt, maybe some people, maybe business is their warrior status. They're
Mhm.
successful in business. But just like women have their thing, I think men also have their own thing as well. And sometimes they mix. I don't know. What are your thoughts as a man on that?
I think men need purpose.
Yeah.
And, purpose just isn't being a father. That's kind of, it's a duty, it's a role. But it's different. They still need to have a purpose. They still need to have a way to provide. It's different for everyone. So,
Absolutely.
for me personally, it's financial security. I want to make sure that my family, and that includes my extended family, is taken care of. And, that's difficult to do. But, there's other ways to help with the security of that family. And that's where I try to learn as much as I can, about doing handiwork or doing car work. I may not be the best, but if I can cut a corner here or cut a corner there to help,
Yeah.
and that's where, working with my brother-in-law and working with other men in the family, to kind of come together and solve these issues. But, my purpose, that's why I do the job that I do here, is because at the end of every single day, I feel accomplished because I know I'm helping Choctaw people and I'm helping give back to a family that may have been like my family at one point in time, or we didn't have, that generational history anymore.
That's what I was going to say. I truly feel that need for a purpose is God given. So, my challenge as a female, so I hope it's okay that I say this, is that
Mhm.
for every Native man out there and every non-Native man as well, what is your purpose? And can that maybe as a hint, it has something to do with being giving and helping others to some degree, whatever that is for you, or it might be purely selfish, but everyone does need a purpose. How we find that, men and women wise, it has its challenges. Right, for me, I truly feel like I found my purpose in this podcast. Whether it lasts forever or not, I don't know. But the fact that me and you right now, we're preserving our stories for other generations, I think that's great. Hopefully everyone out there can find their purposes. And again, sorry you guys that I'm getting so sappy about this, but I think it is important.
We'll have go off on a tangent real quick.
You're
I'll have
good.
tribal members that will call and they'll be like, I'm Choctaw, but I don't know what that means. How do I reconnect? And the first thing is always it's about being community focused. It's about serving a community. And if you're nearby a Choctaw community, which the majority of our tribal members aren't, that's my number one thing is engage yourself in a community and help serve that community. If it's not Choctaw, look for another Native community. But personally, look for things that reconnect you with your ancestors. So the biggest thing is just going outside. It could be gardening, it could be hiking, it could be working with animals, it could be, I think there's a real opportunity we have with our Choctaw ponies, reconnecting our men back to our Choctaw ponies. I think we have some great opportunities there. Especially on the behavioral health side. I One of my friends goes to behavioral health down in Texas, and she goes to equine therapy.
Cool.
And I'm like, what if we could do something like that with our Choctaw ponies? Like that would be, really cool. But anyway,
I know it makes me wonder if there are any Choctaw members out there that work with animals in that therapeutic way and could either donate their time or start a program with Choctaw Nation if we don't already have one.
well, Jones Academy does have a herd,
Yes.
the boarding
Yeah.
school.
I
But
have actually pet those ponies
oh
and they were
yeah.
so sweet. They came running up to me and they were kind of
Mhm.
fighting over who I was petting. So like if I was petting one of them, the other one would jump in and get under my hand. It's
Mhm.
amazing. They were so sweet.
Yeah. I mean, these ponies are so important to our history. And I'm really thankful for all the different families that take care of these ponies. But I think there's a responsibility on behalf of Choctaw people to reinsert themselves back and and help serve these ponies. They deserve our respect as well.
Absolutely.
But
They
anyway,
definitely have a story. I mean, they are the descendants of the ponies that came over from Mississippi during the
mhm,
removal. What a story they have.
mhm, yeah, they have an amazing story.
Stay tuned for part 5 of this series.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.